Hey, I'm glad you're here. You are eavesdropping on my conversations with everyday adults about coping with the tough stuff and how they got from bad to better. I'm Brandy Menefee, and these are coping stories. Today, I'm having a candid conversation with Bonnie about a challenging aspect of her life. Bonnie discovered that being a people pleaser was a character flaw that was causing painful consequences. This conversation hits on a number of things, including people pleasing, pride, religious upbringing, alcoholism, sobriety, and workaholism. Bonnie shares the specific tools she's learned in her personal life and her professional life that have made a huge healthy impact.
My mother called me every day. We were best friends. I started all my sentences with my mom this, my mom that, my mom thinks this. Everybody knew about my mom. Every sentence started with my mom. I had an impression of my mom. Everything I believed was because my mom had taught me, like it just all, I was just my mom junior.
I remember being so envious of that, how much you loved your mom, how close you were. I just thought it was so remarkable that growing up, you weren't this troubled teen. You were a happy, high achieving kid with great relationships with your parents.
I definitely was very accepting, happy in my youth. I thought my parents were the bee's knees. I got straight A's. I just never remember having any big issues. And I was definitely living in a way that made my parents happy and pleased them, and made my teachers happy and pleased them, my friends happy and pleased them. I've never been the customer that goes into the restaurant and asks for a better table. I don't think I've ever sent my meal back. It just honestly doesn't bother me.
Is it something that just doesn't kind of cross your mind, or are you aware of like, oh, I don't want to be that person?
It probably subconsciously is I don't want to be that person. Every time my mother would order eggs Benedict in a restaurant, I would just get into the fetal position in my chair because I knew if the chef didn't bring it exactly the way that my mother liked it, she would just go into lecture mode with the waiter.
Oh my gosh, I can so relate to that.
With your mom?
Yeah, because growing up, we still had smoking sections in restaurants.
Oh, yeah. Oh,
And
yeah.
my mom is a very anti smoking, very vocal about it, very, very dramatic. And so we would walk into a restaurant and the hostess would ask us smoking or non smoking. My mom would say non smoking. And it didn't matter where they sat us in the restaurant because she's got an amazing nose and she would be able to smell the smoke because I mean, we all know that the smoking and non-smoking sections, are a crock of shit. We're all breathing the same air. You're going to be able to smell the smoke even
Yeah.
if it's across the room. And she would dramatically fan herself, fan the air with the menu. She would always ask to change tables, at least twice because of the
Oh,
smoke. It was
mm.
always like, we could never just go into a restaurant and sit down at our table and have a nice meal. There were always problems. We would dread going out to dinner. So when you say that, I know that, the people pleaser in me was definitely conditioned from an early age. Like it just did not want to ruffle feathers with anyone because it felt so terrible to be out with her when she would be like that.
I've often wondered how many times did that actually happen? We were in restaurants a lot. I think it's probably a handful of times my mom was a jerk, and it was usually over Ex Benedict. But, she would have weeks where she just wasn't feeling well or frustrated or irritated, and who knows what else was going on, financially, or
Menopause.
who knows? Now that we're adults and we have these bad moments, I'm like, oh, that might have not been what I thought it was. But the other side of it is these are also the same parents who taught me nothing's important enough to get upset about. You just keep going. Like if I had an outfit I wanted to wear and my mom didn't want me to wear it and had something else in mind, I would wear what my mother wanted me to wear. It wasn't worth it in the way our house functioned. It wasn't worth it to go against her because then you're just going to have a shit day. But if you just went with it, you could have a great time. You prioritize, like, well, that's not that big of a deal. This is my outfit. But when it actually became about, my sexuality and, my happiness, it took several years to, like, garner the strength to just say, sorry, I can't please you anymore.
Have you always known that you are a people pleaser?
I think if I had been asked point blank, are you a people pleaser? I probably would have said something like, who isn't? You know, it was when I had been sober about 19 years that I started talking differently about why I drank. Because, you go into meetings and you tell your story. That's how we're helpful to each other in life in general, but also in meetings. And I used to always say, the go-to comment for almost 20 years was, I was raised in the religious South. I came out to LA. I figured out I was gay. There's no amount of tequila that'll fit those two things together. That was true. Up here on the surface, that math was absolutely 100% true. But that wasn't why I drank. Those were circumstances. There's a lot of people that have that circumstantial evidence in their life, but they're not alcoholics. I drank because way down here beneath the surface, people pleasing was one of them, but it was also my pride. People pleasing was a big deal. You just want to make everybody happy. And not everybody wants you to be gay, particularly your parents.
Particularly your parents.
I didn't really have an awareness of being gay till I was in my mid 20s. And when I figured it out and started to be myself, I started to go, oh, that's what that was. Oh, that's what that was. But I was, I always like to say Glee wasn't on TV. There were no examples. We were taught in church that gay people were going to hell. And I would go home to visit family back when I was in my late 20s and early 30s. I was in the closet. I would act straight. I would, and I was sometimes still going out with boys, but I was definitely not talking about any women in my life or thinking I was gay or, I just would, it was almost like I regressed to, this straight person I had lived my whole life as on the outside.
What was the turning point moment for you?
I've been struggling with figuring out my sexuality for a couple of years, and I was still living in the closet. Most of the people here in LA knew, but I hadn't officially come out to them, but nobody back home really knew. And I was driving home one night from work and I would go through my, friends and family. And I always did, it was like a form of prayer for me where I would think about each person. And some of it was work related, like the to do, like, oh, I'll do that person. Oh, yes, I need to call them about that. And at that point in my life, it was a manageable list of people. It was executives at work or assistants at work, or it was family or this or friends here, or friend who was traveling, like just thinking about people and maybe making a couple of phone calls along the way. But as I was going through my list in my head, I get to like the 20th person and I realized that I'm not telling anybody the truth. There's not one human being on my list, all these people I supposedly love and am close to, that I am being my authentic, honest self with. And I just started crying and I pulled off the road and I was like, well, this has to change.
Why do you think that that was a turning point?
It was a turning point because I was so exhausted with the dishonesty. I felt isolated.
You said you weren't being truthful with anyone. So, not just hiding your sexuality from people back home in Texas.
Yeah. Whatever version I had started to tell LA people was also not true. Like, it might have been that I had already come out to people in Texas and they were fine with it. I hadn't come out to anybody. And I had had people come up to me in LA and say, "Are you gay? Like, are you in the closet?" People just stumbling through life like I was. And I would just adamantly shut it down. No, no, I'm not. And give them some story. It would just flow out of my mouth. But when I started to, name it for what it was, reconciling that was really, really hard because reconciling that meant disappointing an enormous amount of people who really, really had supported me and believed in me and saw great things for me. And so you really, in your formative years, when you're in your 20s and early 30s, I didn't want to let everybody down.
So you grew up this kid in the Bible Belt, you're a major people pleaser, you come out to Los Angeles, you discover that you're gay, you're living kind of separate lives because you're in the closet. So to everybody, to your friends and family back home, you're presenting one way, and then you're presenting a different way in Los Angeles.
Yeah. I think it had just gotten confusing and lonely and stupid.
So that was your breaking point when you were driving home.
There's something happening in my body that I'm ignoring. And that night, I just couldn't ignore it. I was just like, I can't, this is not who I am.
What did you do next?
I booked a flight to Dallas to go home and come out to my mom and dad,
What?
which was absolutely not the right thing to do. Psychologically, you're just setting yourself up for devastation. Actually, Brandy, this is super interesting because I haven't ever talked about this part of my story with people pleasing and pride. I was convinced that I could convince them. I was convinced that I could fly home to Dallas, come out to my mom and dad, get them to understand why this was okay, and still have my mom and dad in my life. Just to think that I could pull that off is a really screwed up sense of pride. That's just like not realistic. Any therapist would have been like, okay, I get it. Slow down. Slow down. Who are your friends out here that you need to talk to? Build the support net. Get the network of people, get the friends, get the best friend from high school, get the beloved teacher from high school, get the college roommates, get the friends out here. Tons of people who were literally supportive from breath one.
Right, start with them.
No, not me. No, I can't do that. I got to book a ticket and tell mom and dad and set myself up for failure because of course I can pull it off and they'll be happy. By the time I talk to them, it'll all be okay. Just really messed up sense of ego and just not living on planet Earth. I mean, just not. It's just not the case with
Yeah,
me.
you're like, let's start with, let's get on a plane, let's go back to the Bible Belt, let's tell the two people who are going to be the hardest to tell.
They're all wrapped up in the people pleasing pride aspect of it too. We are completely codependent.
Right,
And
and now you're expecting this incredible outcome.
expecting the movie version because I don't live on
Oh.
planet Earth. I haven't even walked into an AA meeting yet. That AA taught me how to live on planet Earth.
Did you feel that your drinking at this point was a problem?
Mm-mm, mm-mm.
I mean, because I look back and it's sort of like, obviously we have very different paths, but I look back now on my 20s and I'm like, oh my God, like I was like drunk for everything, like, but that's kind of just what everybody did.
The drinking for me didn't go dark until the last couple years of my drinking. That was when it wasn't about going out and having fun with friends anymore. It had really turned into self-medicating, and it wasn't working anymore.
How has your sobriety helped you see a clearer picture?
I've been sober 20 years, and I go to an average of 2 meetings a week, which has become so much easier to do because of Zoom. And, I started sponsoring people. And so you hear about younger people's meetings, or, gay meetings, or, couple meetings, or whatever. And it really does organically become, part of your life. It is your life. And you dig deeper in the layers of your self discovery.
At what point do you realize that you are a people pleaser and that is a problem?
And that is the way to ask it. When you're working the program, you work the 12 steps. I worked them initially in my first 2 years of sobriety. I worked right through the 12 steps. Since that go through, I discovered that steps 4 and 5 were where the money was at for me. And steps 4 and 5 are, you make a list of the people that you have resentments towards. Like if I was pissed off at you for doing something to me, I would write Brandy, and I would write, made me do a fucking podcast. And then I would, and then I would write what my role was, asked Brandy if I could do the podcast. And then I would realize, that my role was just as, present as yours. And if I hadn't asked in the first place, we wouldn't be here. You get it. You're acknowledging that you are actually in control of your own process. And even though you want to blame someone, when you really dissect it, you're the one that did it. And you start to assess, okay, engaging in that, what did that attack in me? My pride, or my security, or my, finances, or, it's almost makes your life break down like math or science. Like you really become clear on the pieces, the parts you can control, the parts you had nothing to do with, why you're who you are as a human being because of this series of events, and how you can move forward. What I had never really done in working those steps, and I've done a step 4 and 5. I can't think of a few year period where I haven't worked a 4 and 5 about something. Kim and I had a rough chapter in our marriage before the pandemic, actually, which is hilarious to people. But we got into therapy, and I dug in on 4 and 5, and I came out the other side like, oh, wow, okay. And it really rejuvenated our relationship. It just works for me. But what I had never really gone in deeply on, nor had any clarity about, were steps 6 and 7. And step 6 is listing your character flaws. It's literally listing what are the, several things that are an issue for me repeatedly in my interactions with others and with life. And like I said, I don't think it was until my 19th year of sobriety that it just came out of my mouth, this people pleasing aspect. That's a major character flaw for me. And it is at the core of my disease, of my drinking. It is at the core of my mishandling of things, or my misperception of things. It is in the soup of just about all of these scenarios I've had as a kid, just not being comfortable unless everything's okay, and everybody's happy. When that became clear to me, I was like, oh, that's what they're talking about with step 6. That's a character flaw of mine. And 7 is really working to let go of that. It's not changing it. It's, it is what it is, but just not allowing it to be a burden for you anymore. And also, Brandy, just because I figured out a year ago that I drank over people pleasing, I drank over people pleasing. whether I knew it or not. So it exists, it always existed. So carving back the layers over years and years of sobriety and working the steps and clearly getting over the people pleasing aspect, all the healing and the journey had happened. It's just I finally consciously recognized that that had been what was going on. That's the story of my friggin' life, by the way. I just, it takes a minute.
It does. Damn it. Okay, so you count the 12 steps as amazing tools for you, but I know there are tools that you've discovered as a producer working in film and TV production that have really helped you look at things in different ways, break old habits, and expand your mind about how to approach a problem, not in a pride filled, people pleasing way, but in a healthier way, and not fall back into old patterns, old people pleasing patterns.
I had spent so much time constructively solving problems in the workplace with effective tools, but I had never taken those same tools and brought them into my personal life and given it a shot. One of the tools is calling in the experts. When you have to recreate something on film that is authentic and real and has all the layers of what the real event did and should have, you have to call people who were either there or who have studied the subject for a million years, hopefully written a few books about it, or have actually done the thing you're trying to recreate before. And I always like to use the example of when we were in pre-production on a film I worked on in the 90s called Saving Private Ryan. We actually did have to recreate the D-Day invasion. You know, you do that thing at the beginning where you're just like, what do we do? And you're making phone calls that don't turn into anything, and you're trying to get on the beach at Normandy, and they're telling you it's a national memorial and nobody's going to be allowed to film on the beach at Normandy. Of course not. So you remember that movie Braveheart?
Oh, yeah.
They had had a lot of battle scenes that were wonderful on screen, didn't use visual effects, a lot of like, you know, humans and really kinetic. And we really loved the way that looked. So we called the people who had made that movie, you know, the line producers, the production designer, all the people who had created those scenes. And we just asked them how they did it. And they told us. And one key element was the Irish Army, you know, a lot of trained soldiers who weren't on active duty, who could give you a sense of reality. And we simultaneously had pulled these maps out, and we were looking at the topography in these different areas. And we found a coastline in Ireland off the coast of a town called Wexford that looked like the Normandy topography. So then you go, oh, okay, well, we've got these Irish Army soldiers who move like soldiers. They're trained. We have this coastline. Great. And then we accessed a consultant, like who's the smartest human about World War II. Is at the time a guy named Stephen Ambrose, who's passed away, but he's the one who like almost single-handedly raised the money and put the D-Day Museum together in New Orleans, had relationship with hundreds of veterans who were still alive at the time. So we're accessing people who were actually there, people who had done it on screen how we wanted to. Then we went over there, and a few days didn't go very well, but we got it together and figured out how to replicate the D-Day invasion for the first 20 minutes of that movie. And I thought about that after I had disastrously tried to engage with my family back home, its own form of invasion. But I really not prepared myself. You know, I hadn't talked to anyone who'd had to do that. There were thousands of people who had had to sit with their parents and talk about the fact that they were gay in and around the issue of religion. It was embarrassing, actually. Open your eyes, dumbass. There's so much help. There's so much help.
Your approach to a personal problem was drastically different than your approach to a professional problem.
You don't by yourself get on an airplane and fly overseas and get on a beach and try to create the D-Day invasion. That would be ridiculous, right?
Right. So when you realized you had to call on the experts for support in your personal life, what did you do?
I read a couple books that I had not had the nerve to read for years that literally broke down scriptures and addressed things very specifically and what they thought. And the next time I engaged with my parents, I was able to do it. I was able to have a real conversation. I was able to see them very clearly. I was able to really understand how far on the other side of the bridge they were from me. So at the end of the day, it was really me, calling in experts to educate myself. Clarity, clarity, clarity. It was like, I need a therapist who's dealt with the issues of homosexuality and religion. Okay, here's 12. Start calling them. You're not the first person to deal with it. And the weight went off my shoulders. I like to say my entire back relaxed. I'm not alone. And it also enables you to engage with a bunch of people that don't want to be pleased. They're not interested in you pleasing them. They just want to know what's going on with you, what your pain is, what you're struggling with. How can we help you? So that was incredibly helpful.
What's another professional tool you learned to use in your personal life?
I remember when I first moved out to LA, I didn't run around talking about religion. Religion was a huge part of my childhood. The church was our social group. I went to a private Christian school. I was in chapel every day, you know, and I believed all of it. So I was even living it when I wasn't in church, when I was in the classroom, it just was part of my existence. Prayer, very much part of my life. But when I came out here, I got a job at the Walt Disney Studio. I didn't run around talking about God and Jesus. And when I went over to work at Amblin at DreamWorks, I didn't run around talking about God and Jesus initially. Because what started to happen is I was in a couple of meetings a year or two into the job where some questions were posed to the room. And I'm as an assistant at the time, I'm sitting in the background, like taking notes, but all the heads of department are around the table and, Academy Award winning filmmakers and directors and art department people and DPs. And somebody asked the question of how would, in the movie Amistad is the first example I'm thinking of, like in the movie Amistad, how would these slaves, how would the missionaries in our country be teaching these slaves the Bible? Like, do, does anyone here know, like, how a child is taught the Bible? Someone that has no understanding of the Bible, how they're taught? And no one in the room is raising their hand, but I know the answer in detail and have visual references in my own apartment. So I raise my hand and they call on me and I'm like, yeah, I know. Well, how do you know? Well, you remember I went to Christian schools and went to church and, I was taught it my whole life. And so I started sharing what I knew and I found myself in the room the next day with the screenwriter. I had this part of myself that I had been not out about. And it began to be sought after in a very real way that got me in rooms that I would have never been in otherwise. And Saving Private Ryan, there's a sniper in the movie who quotes scripture. And that was the first question was call Bonnie. She'll know. Okay, how many scriptures do you need? It was like breathing for me. It just happened to be who I was. And no one else had it. So what happened to me when I started to be more honest about these parts of me, the reverse happened in Texas because I'm gay. I was born gay. I've always been gay. It's always been there. It is who I am. But it's nothing I talked about or referenced in rooms with friends back home. Well, who do you think they call now? When they encounter something with their own children, in some regards, they all have kids in their 20s now. When they're encountering things with their own kids, when they're encountering things with their kids' friends, anything involving that topic, they call me. And that is something that wouldn't happen if I wasn't bringing my whole self outwardly and openly to all the people that I love and know. So I really encourage anyone that comes into our office or our movie sets or our work life or personal life. I'm like, just bring it all. Because if you don't, how are we going to know how you can be helpful?
Such a great message. But what I love most is that phrasing. How are we going to know how you can be helpful?
That for me, I wish it was something that I had been really taught early on, of not hiding parts of myself, even if I thought they were not going to please the people in the room I was with. If you take people pleasing out of it, if you don't worry the result, if I'm saying something to you and I absolutely take off the table any concern of what your reaction is to it, I'm good.
So we've talked about drinking as a coping mechanism, dishonesty and hiding parts of yourself as a coping mechanism. And I know that escaping into work has also been a coping mechanism.
Workaholism is a great escape for a people pleaser. I used to joke that I'd actually been in training for my career my whole childhood because I was working for my mother. And when getting something done, doing it effectively, being smart about it, bringing a different experience to the table, all these things we talk about, but you're just spending your day making a lot of other people happy. They're loving it. They're telling you all the time, oh my God, where have you been? You are the best. Oh my God, this is so wonderful. Thank you so much. Just getting that people pleasing dose every 2 seconds and lying to get it, like wanting them to be happy. So allowing them to live in their never, never land, saying things that enable them to stay pleased, because that's the addiction. It's interesting. I have a handful of young people that I work with now, and I'm sure they lie to us. I'm sure there's little fibs that happen. I don't think anybody is like infallible or, perfect. But man, they tell us a lot of truth. We get a lot of truth. Like, oh, I forgot to do that. Or, oh yeah, I totally flaked on that. Oh man, I don't know what happened. I just totally screwed that up. It's a generational thing, I think. And I think a lot of it has to do with the internet and how like things are constantly changing and plans don't get confirmed till you're pulling up to the venue. And it's just crazy how digital, how amorphous everything is now. And I try to be casual and roll with it, but it's just, we used to lock in those plans and stick to them, and it's challenging. At least once a week, I'm kind of taken aback by their ownership of screwing up, because I didn't never do that. I never said, oh, I forgot, or oh, I didn't do that. You wanted to people please, you didn't want to get yelled at. So you would just say, oh, yeah, I took care of that. Let me go follow up on that, see what happened. Even though you totally forgot to make the phone call or whatever the scenario was.
Right.
Now, I will say one thing I was really good about is never blaming anybody else. I never threw people under the bus. And that was some sort of moral code for me. I might tell you I'd done it and I didn't know what had happened, even though I'd forgotten to do it. But I would never say somebody else did it.
I never connected workaholism and people pleasing before.
I definitely hid in the work because it's a really easy place to go to get the affirmation that feels good. I get juice from getting things done. I 100% do. I like doing the laundry. I like that it has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And if my daughter or my wife offer to help me fold, I don't want them to. I literally have this visceral reaction of, no, I'm doing this. And when I'm done, oh my God, I feel so great. So I am just in an ocean of people pleasing here. I'm pleasing myself. I don't want anyone else to do it. I want to do it exactly how I want to do it and be done. I'm pleasing my wife. Yeah, but she's offered several times. It would have been so easy to be like, yeah, come over here. We would have gotten it done twice as fast. And I'm honest about it. I'll give myself that. I am honest about it. No, I want to do it. I want to complete it, finish it, take it to everybody's room and be done.
Right. You want 100% of all the good feelings that you're going to get.
Getting your people pleasing tank filled by diving into workaholism is interesting.
I want to go back to applying professional tools to your personal life. Has it gotten easier and easier to do that? Like, does it come naturally now?
I don't have to do this as much anymore, but I have to trick myself. If I encounter a personal situation, like my daughter was really upset. This is when she was like in third grade or fourth grade, and she didn't know how to verbalize it, but she kept saying to me, something's going on in my brain. And it was in and around math. It was during the pandemic. I had been in intimate settings with her at home because she was doing schooling from home. She was in tears several times in and around math. And then I'd had to go on location to work on a film. And I wouldn't say we were in crisis, but something was going on that we needed to figure out and help her and give her the support that she needed. And I remember calling in the experts. I remember really rolling up my sleeves and working on it and telling myself, okay, this is something going on in my personal life. What would I do if this was happening on the film or on the project? What would I do? And transferring that capability and confidence and work ethic to a confusing situation until we figured it out. And it's just been invaluable to me. And we figured it out. We got the proper testing. We got her the help she needed. It's kind of like dyslexia in reading. It's just this with basic math. Once we got a calculator into her life, she was a new person. Because if she could do the basic building blocks, she could do all the abstract, complex stuff. She's like in honor geometry now, but she has her calculator with her. And that was all she needed. She needed an earthly tool to navigate this thing that was really confusing her.
Wow, good for you to know to bring in the experts, you know, and seek out examples and support.
Well, and roll up your sleeves and do the work. It's not going to get solved by magic. Just understanding that it's a clear situation, it's solvable, but we're not going to figure it out until we look at it. It's not going to, ignoring it is only going to make it worse. She would have started using tactics to cheat on tests or, get away with it. And, what would have she would have stopped talking to us about it. What would sweet little 8, 9-year-old kid, what would she have started to do to not make it work? And we've had a couple of points of crisis with her, like bully at school and things that these kids deal with. And it's been really great to approach them as, okay, this is a situation. Let's figure this out. What are we going to do? Call the experts is always the first one I do. I just start picking up the phone. And I talk to 20 strangers before I find the right human. But you will, if you just don't give up, you will always find the right human. and you will learn something on every single phone call. You will literally learn a piece on every single phone call. And people are so good. People want to help. People will walk out of their jobs to call you back because they've gotten a message from a friend that your teenager needs help. There are people on this planet that will literally come, total strangers, because they know how to help you. And they know that one phone call from them. Well, I was on the phone with a retired psychiatrist. He's like, he hasn't practiced for a decade, but he knew what was going on in one scenario we were involved in. And he had heard from a friend of a friend, and he called me. And he said, you don't know me, but I've heard, and I have 2 numbers I want you to call. I mean, just lovely people, you know? So I just think not shying away from things and really looking at them, getting the emotion out of it and looking at it as a problem you're trying to solve at work can end up being really productive for your personal life.
I get that so much because I could see a clear difference between my personal life and my professional life. And I remember one day thinking, I'm a supervising producer and, I lead teams to glory. If I approached relationships and problems and situations in my personal life the way I deal with them in my professional life, I'm like, oh my God, my personal life would be amazing. Seeing that clear distinction was like, gosh, why am I so different in my professional life than I am in my personal life? So I love hearing that the lessons you learned in your professional life, you have now applied to your personal life and found the same great success.
Well, I think for me, working the 12 steps in the AA program really brought me to a place of not finding my happiness through people pleasing and recognizing that people pleasing was actually a flaw, and that continuing to work my steps and only be responsible for my part in something and getting out of the results on the other end, it made me have a much healthier relationship with myself and therefore others. And outside of the 12 steps, bringing sort of things I had figured out at work that literally are tools that just open my mind up. Like, bringing my whole self into a room, either it being my religious upbringing or the fact that I'm gay or the fact that I've been sober for 20 years or just anything. The fact that I had a bad chapter in my marriage, the fact that my child has had 2 or 3 really challenging chapters. It just is a game changer in conversations with people. It just changes the game. I highly recommend trying it. Revealing something about yourself, it just shifts a conversation and you have a real one.
I really appreciate Bonnie's candor, sharing her personal experience and how she's coped with the burden of being a people pleaser. I can so feel her sense of power and peace of showing up as your authentic, honest self, bringing your whole self outwardly and openly to all the people you love and know. My hope is that Bonnie's story or her professional tools that she's learned to apply to her personal life bring you some comfort. I'm really glad you stuck around. Thanks for listening to Coping Stories. And one last thing. If you're looking to hire someone to facilitate conversations about sensitive subject matter, or you need to hire a trauma interviewer, or you're interested in becoming my memoir client, or you want to share about a challenging chapter in your life and how you coped, either for this podcast or for my written mental health storytelling series, find me on Instagram at Mental Health Storyteller, or my Substack, Brandy Menefee, Mental Health Storyteller, or contact me through my website, prostorytellers.com. And of course, there's always LinkedIn.